I'm really pleased to be back collaborating with HiCAS and FAST and offering this presentation, which is based on the course that is taught by Professor Duncan Semester in MIT Sloan Fellows MBA program. I was fortunate to complete and take part just a couple of years ago. Professor Semester was my advisor, and my research was concerned with issues in strategy. Just by way of background, academically and professionally, it's been quite interdisciplinary. Most recently at MIT, my research was indeed concerned with strategy as well as operations research. At Tufts University, I completed a Master of Science degree in computer science. Media management was my subject at Ohio University. I took part in research at ICES, which is the Center for Economic Science at George Mason University. And of course, my undergraduate alma mater, Yerevan State University, Department of Radiophysics or Electrical Engineering, if you prefer. My two active startup companies are Imaginomic and Notogram. Imaginomic is quite an established company that specializes in image processing software. And Notogram is also a software business, and it focuses on developing education applications for music and solfeggio training. With that, let me move to the next slide. This is how Professor Semester starts this presentation, and I borrowed this particular slide because it resonates deeply with some of the key issues with strategy thinking and strategy teaching. So there's a quote that's attributed to Albert Einstein that I think is quite cogent and quite relevant to what we're discussing today. It says that if Einstein had 1 hour to save the world, he would spend 55 minutes to think about it, and then 5 minutes to execute on that thinking. What really this quote highlights is a key issue that is truly present in the current organizational culture, which is focused on productivity, which is often synonymous with execution. Professor Semester has an article titled "The Lost Art of Thinking in Large Organizations." I encourage everyone to find it and read it. What really it highlights is that often the strategic thinking is absent from major decisions that company takes. And it has many underlying reasons, and some of them are truly evolutionary. We humans are not necessarily wired for reflection and deep thinking. I would imagine that since the times we were in caves and were forced to flee animals and be on lookout for danger, executing and acting has been a primary instinct. So it's not unlike when we're faced now with a business challenge or a modern era problem. I think often we equal execution and action to with productivity and success. So in many ways, I want this quote and this approach to become a key aspect of our discussion. That truly, when we think about strategy and we discuss strategy, it's very important to understand that a key task of strategy is to engage in deep reflection and thinking, which is not necessarily a culture in most organizations, and especially startups who tend to be thought of as this agile, very fast performing, swift entities that are supposed to quickly test and experiment and come up with the results very quickly in order to compete for funding, in order to compete to gain market share. I would like that by the end of this session, at least there will be a big question in your minds as to what is a better approach to building lasting, resilient companies and teams, and ability and capacity to think deeply is a key aspect of strategic thinking. So one way to think about thinking is to come up with what we would call a framework. In other words, a set of constructs, heuristics, approaches to help us deal with complex issues. To reduce this complexity, to help us approach problems that can vary greatly from the type, depending on the type of business you're engaged in, on the type of market you're exploring. And hence the need for a robust framework that has been tested and that can provide good results and aid in our thinking and planning process. This framework is known as Create, Capture, and Deliver. And I'd like, by the end of the session, for you to have at least a high-level appreciation of this framework. As I mentioned earlier, this is something that has been tested and proved to be quite successful. To help us to develop a common language, when we think about creation, or the create portion of this session, creating value, as a starting point, I like to think about as the potential of that initiative, that is the market size that can be reached, targeted, addressed by your solution or service. When we speak about capturing, that is capturing the value, I like us to think about the horizontal competition. That is the competitive landscape, the other companies that are in the same arena that are going after your customers. And the question is how much of that market, how much of that value we're able to capture. And then we're discussing the deliver component of the framework. I'd like you to consider the vertical competition. And by vertical competition, we mean all the partners and all the solutions and services that you would depend on in order to deliver your product to your customer, or your upstream and your downstream partners that would collaborate with you, or rather compete with you. We'll discuss it at length to deliver the value to the end customer. And so with this understanding, we'll start the section 1 on creating value, and we'll ask the very first question about why products and services fail. And you'll notice that with each slide, or with most of the slides in this presentation, we'll be posing question first. And this is also another trick or another method to aid our strategic thinking. What we're trying to achieve as strategists for our companies and our startups, what we're trying to do is to ask a better question by the end of the day. That is, by questioning the fundamentals, by questioning the basic assumptions, we want to arrive to a set of recommendations and a set of strategies for our startups that reflect a deeper understanding and deeper insight about our markets and about our customers. So 3 underlying questions for these sections would be, how do firms create value? Right? Who is the customer? And how much value would our company create for that customer? Right. So those are three key questions we'll be trying to answer with this section, and these are truly the key questions that you as startuppers need to consider deeply for your company. I mean, truly, I cannot stress this or stress this enough. This is what would underpin your strategy: your deep understanding of how and what you create for your customers. To understand that, you would need to understand and define your customer, and then you will be able to find a way to measure, or at least to understand how would you try to measure the value that you create for your customer. So fundamentally, there are two ways to create value. You could save cost, that is, could be save money, that is a cost reduction strategy. And you can do that by improving operations. You could improve operations within your own company, hence reducing the cost for you. And then it will be a decision whether you want to pass those savings to the end customer. Or you can offer a product or service that improves operations for your customer. And hence you would deliver value through cost reduction for your customer. The second way to create value is to improve the customer experience. That is to offer a value differentiation. Do something differently, do something better than others that adds value to your customer. Now, obviously, you can do this together, which would be a wonderful thing, and many companies attempt to do both. There are companies who focus on a very specific set of solutions, or even have a very unique culture that focuses on cost reduction. If you're familiar with a retailer Costco in the United States, the business model is about cost savings. Many companies that operate in the technology sphere, they offer solutions that reduce cost. They also offer solutions that enhance the customer experience. Similarly, and when applied to agricultural sector, you could think of solutions and services that improve operations. For example, it could be new innovative irrigation mechanism for produce, which could save a cost for producing a certain product, or it could be an innovation that produces a new crop, or a safer crop, a better tasting product, a better tasting apple, a crunchier apple, a juicier apple. So this is an important distinction, and I want this to establish well today, that you should think deeply about your service and a solution that you plan to develop, and understand and really distill the value that it will be delivering, and understand whether it's a cost reduction for your customer, whether it's cost reduction through your internal operations, whether it's a cost reduction with your solution, or whether this is something that provides a new value, a different value, something unique and better than your competitors, or something that has not been provided and offered before. And there's another distinction between these two, of course, to note that obviously cost reduction has a floor, that is, you could improve on operations and reduce cost, but you cannot improve it beyond reducing it to zero. So that will be perhaps the key difference between the two value creation modes. Well, when we think about the value creation, a very important, of course, question is defining the customer. And many companies, and especially startups, and I'd say many mature companies, are an ongoing effort to define their customer, both in better understanding the customer and hence being able to deliver the products and services that are requested, needed, or indeed in trying to find new markets and new customers. So what are the questions that we need to ask when we think on a very high level about this? At the very high level, you really have two variables, which is the number of customers and the value per customer. These two numbers together at a very high level define the market opportunity in the market size. And at a strategy level, this is the starting point for understanding whether your value that you're creating, what the opportunity for that value is, and what is the scope at your market presence or potential market presence. The second question is, will customers recognize the value? And it's hard to overstress this. I would probably say this is one of the key problems that companies face, and perhaps especially startups, though established companies have a similar challenge that could deepen and worsen with time. So the good news being a startup is that if you ask this question early on, that would definitely provide a vector, a strategic vector, and path to company evolution that would be certainly much more optimal. So the question we're asking, will or why this is important for customers to recognize the value, because for a long time, it was considered that developing a product that is technologically sound and innovative is very good, as long as we think that it addresses the needs of the customers. And very often, this was the key recommendation you would hear from marketing and strategy professionals. Say, well, this is very important to know your customers. It's very important to know the customer needs, and which is indeed very important. And accordingly, by doing so, we can discover these needs, perhaps even some latent needs, the ones that have not been even addressed, an unmet need that your innovative solution would solve, would address, and hence you would have a winning product. Well, the reality is somewhat different. There are many companies who have a wonderful product, yet customers do not purchase it. The product is indeed provides great amount of value, and if they were to purchase it, it would prove to be quite an important and helpful acquisition for them. Yet it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen because many companies fail to ask the question: will the customers be able to discover and recognize the value that was created for them? This seemingly simple consideration is not trivial at all. And this is really something that we went to with our company. Many companies that are built out of an engineering talent and are led by the founders who are engineers tend to often end up in a situation when they develop products for themselves. When there is an engineering, an innovation challenge, the team steps up and finds a brilliant solution, which at the end is not quite recognized by the customers. And if they don't recognize it, if they're not able to discover it, they will not buy it. And so when we first started our software, we were one of the fastest algorithms, with one of the fastest algorithms on the market. And we're quite proud of it. And we're so preoccupied by that challenge that when competitors starting to improve their algorithm, we invested a lot of R&D trying to further improve and optimize the algorithm, which we're able to do. In fact, at some point, we were about 7 to 8 times faster than any other algorithms on the market. To give you the context, this is an image processing algorithm that works on the client side on a desktop to provide a certain image processing capability. So at some point, what we did realize that for the end customer, this is not something they're really recognizing. In other words, even those who were savvy enough and had the expertise to look for it and appreciate it would not necessarily use it as a criteria for a purchasing decision. So as a startup, and certainly as a mature company as well, it's very important to understand, do we want to invest in R&D, in a feature or functionality, if we don't know if the customers would recognize it? So this is a principal question that we need to ask in developing our strategy. Not only that we're developing to address an unmet need, not only that we're innovating to come up with a product that will be very competitive and groundbreaking, but perhaps much more importantly, thinking about whether the demand side, whether the customers would have the capacity, expertise, and ability to recognize what you've created for them. So for your ideas, for your startups, for your solutions, whether it's a service or a product, think hard about what you think is important for customers, which truly can be a revolutionary product or service for them. How will they go about discovering the value of what you've created? And so when you think about it, to aid you in formulating the key components of customers' decision-making process, we'll ask the following questions. How would customers search for information before they make their decision, or before they have the set of criteria to make the purchase decision? So let's think about it. How do we search for information, especially in the internet age? And we'll address the internet and the magic of technology and the change that it brought about in the last few decades with the ability to search for more information online. Well, necessarily the search is a function of cost and benefit. Depending on the type of purchase, we would spend more time and will incur more cost to acquire information if we perceive that to be beneficial to our purchase decision. Good example would be, for example, if you are about to purchase a car, you would probably not take a decision within an hour. You perhaps would take at least for a few days, if not longer, maybe a few weeks, to search for a car, to maybe do some research, perhaps go and try one and test drive, and then to take that decision. If you were to purchase a real estate, that perhaps be even take a longer time and would necessarily justify that cost to search. It doesn't have to be a B2C scenario, and for you and the startups who are in fact in B2B business, that is in you developing product and or service that would be addressing a business need rather than an individual customer need. I'd like you to think about your customer as the business manager, as the procurement officer, or the procurement office of the particular business that would be concerned and tasked with this process. So it would be not unlike an individual customer looking to buy something that is, again, going through the search, information gathering, and then decision-making process. Except, of course, with especially bigger companies, you would expect to have a well-established process of search and information gathering. With perhaps even bigger organizations, you might have certain procurement rules that, for example, would have threshold for above certain purchase amounts that would require multiple bids, which necessarily would increase cost of that search. But the company would engage in that procurement process because it believes that that additional cost justifies, and the additional information gained through that process justifies that cost. So when you think about your product and service, please consider the function of the cost of benefit that your customer, be it a business customer or an end user customer, they would have to incur and agree to in order to discover your product and discover the value of your product or solution. Another criteria for search is a prior expertise. That is, the prior expertise of the procurement office or the individual customer is necessarily a factor determining this cost and benefit function. And what the research shows is that it's really an inverted U. That is, if we have two variables, the search, the amount of search, and the other variable would be the prior expertise, what we see is that on one end of the spectrum, when you have a customer who's an expert, that is someone who has a lot of prior expertise, that they would not necessarily search for more information. That is, they would not engage in extensive search for procurement or purchase decision because they perceive the problem to be known because they're the expert. Similarly, or perhaps controversially, the customers who don't have a prior expertise or don't have much information and would indeed benefit the most from acquiring more information. They also are not searching precisely because of the not having enough information to compel a further investigation. And what we see is really it's in the crowd in the middle that would engage in reasonably more extensive search because they know enough to know that they don't know enough, and so they engage in search to discover more, and so the learning curve and the search amount differs for them. So again, for your products and services, what you want to understand is for your customer segment, what would be the distribution of different modes of search for your particular product and service, and the demographics of that target market. So one example of the work that my advisor was engaged was with a pharmaceutical company, and they indeed were able to come up with a very important new drug to treat rather painful condition. A prior treatment for this condition was had a number of side effects. So the benefits of this new innovative product, drug, were truly compelling. Yet the company was not able to sell it. And upon closer examination, what was revealed is that the doctors, who would be the equivalent of experts, who had the prior expertise of prescribing the original drug for the last 30 years, did not necessarily look to find a new drug, but rather knew that with the symptoms and with this condition, this is the default protocol, this is the default drug they prescribe. So an ability to compel these experts, these doctors, to search for a new medicine, to search for a new drug, and discover and recognize the new values was truly a challenge for a big company. So similarly, in your scenarios, in your respective startup or business context, you would need to think about what these different types of customers and the distribution of these customers would mean for your product to be discovered and recognized. So what we just discussed was ability of the customer to search, and whether or not they search was a function, as we said, of their prior expertise, as well as the function of the cost and benefit. Now, what happens when we can't really search? How do we come up with an understanding for a product or service, and the quality of that product or service, if we can really search? Well, we do it through inferences. That is, we use the features that we can observe to infer and recognize features we cannot observe. And often this is done on a subconscious level. I have a McDonald's logo here because the example that Professor Semester provides is of McDonald's recommendation to its franchisees, its partners on the ground that run the restaurants, to keep their parking lot clean. And so we immediately, question whether this is really a key factor and why this is so important. Because obviously it's nice to have a clean parking lot, but why this would be an important factor when we talk about search or inference vis-a-vis the customers? Well, what happens is that if we imagine the context of a McDonald's restaurant, if you're driving by a McDonald's restaurant, you can't really see the cleanliness inside the restaurant, if it's kitchen, if it's bathrooms, if it's dining hall, things that would you normally compel you consider a place to dine. What you can see though is the parking lot. And so the argument is that we often, as customers, we make inferences and conclusions that, in fact, some of them are subconscious, and those that are subconscious are the most powerful ones. We use the cues and things we can observe to make assumptions and inferences about things that we cannot. So again, thinking about your product or service, you should ask yourself the following question. If my customers cannot search for information to take a decision regarding the purchase of my product, are there an observable inferences that I can make about the quality and the value that our product and service provides without necessarily being able to experience it or to know it firsthand? Right? So search for information and inferences are the two ways the customers will try to come to a conclusion about the product or service. So in this context, it's very important to ask the question and to think about how the internet impacted the value of brands. And the reason we want to think about it is because brand is necessarily one point of inference that we rely on when we cannot search for information. That is, over time, we develop an understanding of the quality of the product based on a brand. That is, when we cannot search for information and we cannot compare that information because it doesn't have a spec sheet. That is, if I'm buying, for example, not necessarily a product, but I'm buying a service, then it's much harder to compare that service with another service unless, for example, I have very good reviews, and even then, that's not reliable. So I rely heavily on brand reputation to take that decision. On the other hand, if my product or service has very well established criteria that I can compare with another product, then that information could potentially figure much more prominently than the brand. For example, if you're developing an agricultural sector solution, could be an irrigation solution, could be maybe a drone aerial technological solution to monitor the crops, perhaps the technical specification of the drone, its flight time, some other technological specs would be a good criteria for comparison and information search and comparison. However, if you're providing a product that is not easily, there's no spec sheet to compare, then the customer would heavily rely on the reputation and the brand recognition. And so that would be for you as a startup, as a company that embarks on investment in a certain aspect of their business, to recognize whether investment in brand early on vis-a-vis investment in some other type of perception by the customer would be more important. And so when the internet was starting up, let's say, or when was the promise of internet was indeed big vis-a-vis these issues, everyone recognized that perhaps this would be the mechanism by which the search cost would be greatly reduced. Hence, the function of cost and benefit for information search would be greatly impacted by this. And it certainly was, and is still indeed the case for certain industries and products, for example, for travel, for finding your, the best travel arrangements, be it airline tickets, and some other areas. The promise of internet indeed turned to be a revolutionary effect. In some other respects, it has not. In fact, before the smartphones, one could argue that because the internet was not present at the point of sale, it did not really impact the decision-making process, and because it simply did not provide the type of information search and comparison mechanism that the advent of the smartphones, along with, of course, internet capability, was able to provide. And so it's important to understand that for your product and service, how much of that search cost reduction that was brought by new technologies, internet, smartphones, would be relevant in communicating the value of your product or service to your customer. And so let's think about the following. How can customers evaluate your products or services? So we asked these questions about search of information, inference based on observable cues. Do we want to really think about this as a first step in our startup strategy, or is it really a secondary question? What I hope we're able to achieve with this first component is for you to recognize that the discussion about customer perception has been largely absent from major company decisions, because it's not been necessarily part of the strategic thought. Increasingly, though, in addition to coming up with an innovative product, with a revolutionary product, in addition to making sure that this innovative product addresses an unmet need, it's very important to add to this discussion the question whether or not this value and this really valuable product or service would be recognized by your customer. And whether or not it's recognized is really the first question, because really what you want to establish is how much value would they create. That is, how much value the customers will see in your product. Okay? So as a summary, I want you to really go beyond these initial questions, and vis-a-vis your own startups initiatives, ask these questions again. How do we create a value? Yeah, are we creating it on the supply side or demand side? That is, are we improving our operations, hence reducing the cost, and be able to pass these savings to the customer, whether it's a business to business with a supply chain solution, or whether this is actually saving cost for the end customer or adding value to that end customer. You want to think deeply who your customer is. Again, asking these questions. What is the number of customers? What is the value per customer? And the value per customer is not really necessarily the value that you can think of, but necessarily the value that the customer recognizes in your product and service. Okay? So before moving to the next component, I'd like to open maybe for a few questions I do think it's really important to make sure that if there are some clarifications I could provide, this would be the time to do it. Hi, Gus. Could you please help me understand if there are questions? Yes, if there are questions from the audience, and if I could clarify.
Actually, I will. I would suggest you to move forward. I will pay attention to the chat and ask the participants to write their question in the chat part. And if they will be, I will interrupt you and ask the question if that works.
Excellent.
Great, thanks, Archon.
So the next window for the questions will be by the end of this session, and I will speed this up. I understand we'll be running out of time otherwise. And so let's say you've done this work, you have asked these questions in advance, you have put your strategy hat, and you were able to think for those 55 minutes before moving on to the execution of your startup plan. Is that sufficient? Have we really addressed the key strategic issues? Not quite, of course. You were able to define your value proposition. That is, what is it to distill? What is it that you're offering to your customers? You're able to understand your customer and their needs and who the customer is. You're able to say, well, this is how they will go about looking for my product and service, and this is really how they would make an inference about my product or service. And in fact, I would be able to determine how much they value my product service. Because again, the key question by the end of this first thought experiment to ask is, will the customers recognize what I've created for them? And that's the question I really want you to take away from this discussion, from the first section of this session. So once you created this value, it's important to recognize as a startup that you're entering a market that I would imagine you have done your analysis, that you were able to identify perhaps some competitors. And so the question, as we defined at the beginning, is that in thinking about horizontal competition, we are necessarily defining the competitive landscape, the other companies present and or potential future that would be present in your market that is developing a similar product or service targeting a similar or same customer segment. So in developing common language, I'd like to define three concepts that would be very helpful in communicating this part of the framework. By market power, I want you to understand the ability in your market by your company to set or influence prices. And of course, as a startup, it's usually you are on the receiving end of this. That is, if you're entering a mature market, then the market power is really with the incumbents often. And as much as I like to use the word disruptive and platform and revolutionary, the understanding of the market power balance for a startup is very important. That is the ability by the incumbents to set the prices, which is really the definition of monopoly or the market power, is what most of the startups have to encounter. By sustainable competitive advantage, we will mean ability by your company to maintain its position in the market under a constant threat from its competitors. And we'll define the next item, strategic resources, the resources that are unique and would be hard to come by or not be acquired by your competitors. That is strategic resources that can help you maintain the sustainable competitive advantage under constant threat of your competitors, and resources that are not necessarily easily replicated by your competitors. So, and we'll see what the examples of these resources are. So, what differentiates, strategic resources from, let's say, what we would not consider to be a strategic resource? Is the question of ownership control, right? Is the one factor of whether a resource would be considered to be strategic. That is, do you, your company, have control over this particular resource or ownership of this particular resource? Right? Does this resource really differentiate you from your competitors? Does it provide differentiation for your product or service you provide? Is the resource sustainable? That is something that I can maintain this resource. Imagine the resource to be a certain stock level, almost like a bucket filled with water. So your resource being the content of this bucket. Can you maintain sustainably the level of that content, the level of that resource? And of course, does this strategic resource ultimately translate into a customer satisfaction? And I do have a picture of Henning Mkhitaryan as an example of a resource. And this is, I'd like you to ponder and think about this. And by the end of this component, if you could provide your thoughts to HiCast via chat, whether or not you would consider Henning Mkhitaryan, who you know is quite a midfielder, a soccer midfielder, and so whether you think he would be considered by the team, by the club, by the football club, to be a strategic resource. So I'll give you just this few examples of strategic resources to compel you to think about your startup and your companies. And as a startup, you normally tend to have a certain categories of these resources. And it will be also interesting to see how you would be able to seek for them and define this for yourselves. And again, if you could maybe give an example or two at the end of this session for chat to HiCast, so that we could, I could circle back and provide more clarifications. So, for example, a cost advantage. If your product and service, based on your cost structure and your operational excellence, if you have, for example, a sustainable cost advantage, right? Would that be considered a strategic resource? Well, we necessarily need to look at it in a context of your market. So the questions you would ask is, are your customers price sensitive? So if your customers are price sensitive, if this is the segment that you're targeting, then sustainable cost advantage could be a strategic resource. And I'd like to really amplify the keyword is sustainable. That is a cost advantage, yet you'd be able to maintain on the threat or price dump and price war with your competitors. If we're able to maintain and sustain that cost advantage without necessarily incurring too much damage, that is sustainable goes both ways. You want it to be something that your company can afford to do, and does it not because it's a tactical necessarily tool, but something that inherently something that you do because the value you create for your operations, and you can provide this sustainable cost advantage. So again, a good example I mentioned earlier is a Costco. The business model is built around really a culture of austerity and low cost retailing. Brands. Can brand be a strategic resource? Well, indeed, it can be. Then again, you would ask the question, what is the context? Are we in a market or an information arena where customers can search? In other words, where the customer perception is not necessarily dominated by a brand perception. Well, in situations when it is, then necessarily investing heavily in brand, maintaining a brand as a strategic resource makes a lot of sense, especially when you're providing a service where as we discussed, the information search or making inferences based on spec sheet is not available. What about relationships? Business relationships, by formal women relationships that are contractual, or informal relationships that are built on many years of successful partnerships with your suppliers, or customers for that matter. Would that be a strategic resource? Indeed. In fact, it is a source of a strategic strategic advantage for many companies. Being in a market, having these relationships is very important. Often the informal relationships play a major role in whether or not you would continue to work with a certain supplier, or whether or not a new company would be able to take that business. So relationships and nurturing this, building these relationships in certain industries, in fact, it can be the deciding factor whether or not you would be successful. So again, in your context, think if this is something you would want to invest heavily and ensure that you have a sustainable relationship resource stock knowledge. And in particular context, I want you to focus on the knowledge of your customers, the demand versus supply side knowledge, right? That also could be a source of competitive advantage. But is this something that could be easily know-how that could be easily replicated? Well, if it is, then it's not necessarily a strategic resource. However, if this knowledge has been gained through a specific set of procedures, it was gained through many years and expertise in a certain market, in working with certain set of suppliers, that can also be a very important resource. Human capital. This is an interesting and perhaps for many companies probably most important, especially in technology field, resources. I often like to link the human capital with relationships. That is, to define human capital necessarily as a relationship resource that you share with your team. But before we go there, we can think also as a human capital as a contractual relationship with your teammates, with your colleagues that the company has. And in that case, can we consider it to be a strategic resource? Well, certainly Henrik Mkhitaryan would be considered a valuable resource. Certainly it will be considered a unique resource and differentiated resource. So one criteria, if you remember from the slide before, was ownership and control. How much ownership control the football club has over Henrik Mkhitaryan? Because the definition of a strategic resource was our ability to sustainably maintain the resource stock. So this is implicitly what we're highlighting here is the factor of time. So if this is a term contract, or this is something that can end, or some other club can have my football player, right? So in building your business, in building your relationships with your team, it's very important to understand that human capital is not necessarily a strategic resource unless you're able to build this formal and informal strong relationships that can survive some of the challenges that you would normally have with the talent acquisition and retention. This is also something that probably is known as culture. That is culture of a company a strategic resource? And I guess with this definition, I would say it's one of the key strategic resources and probably one of the trickiest to attain and sustain. Yet it can be hugely rewarding to have a culture that is a strategic resource. In fact, in many ways, that could be the only strategic resource that the company can have. in a fast-pacing technological environment, many things that we take for granted that could have been constant years ago, be it a brand or technology solution, are in fact much more dynamic nowadays. And ability to build a culture that is sustainable under the threat from your competitors to get best of your employees, best of your talent, or for them simply leave the company is very important. And for that, I'd like to, because we were talking about culture, I'd like you to give you a definition of an organizational culture that I find to be very cogent and compelling. Professor Bob Gibson of Sloan Management provided this definition, and it really deeply resonates with me. He defines organizational culture as a shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion. Shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion. That is, how do we act as a team? How do we act as a company when the rules are not really spelled out? What are these unwritten rules, unwritten conduct that we believe in, that we share, and that we act together, defines in many ways the culture of our company. And so ability to build this culture and sustain it could be truly the key competitive advantage and strategic resource. And the last one is also an example that I think is understated, but in certain markets can be very, very powerful strategic resource. The switching cost. That is, if my customer is presented with a product or service, let's say for all things equal, same quality, same price, what could prevent my customer to switch over to this product? And many companies, and especially startups, do not quite recognize this as a source of competitive advantage because they're startups, because they're not in the market and don't necessarily have customers. But thinking about the barriers or the costs associating from switching from your solution and your product to competitor's product could be a source of formidable competitive advantage. So again, thinking about your services and product, think about how a decision-making process for a customer, what it would entail if the customer were to consider to switch from you to a different provider. Another question that is often asked, is market share a resource? Again, in a startup scenario, often we don't think about this because we're not at that stage. It is very important to understand because it also provides insight to positioning as well as insight to the incumbent, to the world of the incumbents, and understanding how to best position your company and your startup within the existing context. And so market share could be a strategic resource if we were to consider the following questions. Does it contribute to the brand? That is, does market share necessarily associated with the brand, right? That is, we know that my brand is about being the search engine, if I'm to Google, or being the operating system, right? And so necessarily retaining and sustaining the perception of a sizable market share, for example, could be a contributor to the brand, and hence serve potentially as a strategic factor in strategic resourcing. Are there network externalities? Yeah, and for those who don't know what the network externalities are, we can define them as and normally the example that we bring for network externalities is an example of a fax machine. When the value that your product or service creates is a function of the number of the customers, that is the users of product and service. If you have only one customer, then having a fax machine obviously doesn't make much sense. If you have two or just a few fax machine owners, again, it's not as compelling to have that as a product or service. It's really the number of the users of the system that would then necessarily make this a compelling product. And so often you can hear this to be a factor in building a platform business. An example of it would be Amazon, or would be the App Store, where necessarily the number of customers of Amazon and would be compelling factor for the suppliers, that is the sellers on the Amazon platform, and vice versa. The number of different products and services that are sold on Amazon would be a function and a factor of for the buyers on Amazon. So it's only when you have a requisite number and, dynamically speaking, a synchronized growth on both sides of this platform that you would find a platform to be valuable. So if there are network externalities, then indeed market share would be a strategic resource. In fact, by this definition, this is the fundamental requirement for a platform business, and the only way for them to gain market share or become a platform is the presence of this network externality. And again, the switching costs, right? If the market share, you would be asking the question that we discussed in the previous slide, that the cost that the customer would have to incur to switch to a competitor would be a factor, and the market share indeed in that sense would play a role. So what do you control in a situation when you enter a competitive landscape? What are the things that, as a startup and as a mature company, you can do to influence the outcome? And of course, you want to focus on markets that are tilted in your favor. And what do we mean by that? We mean that a careful examination of your strategic resources should uncover and help you reach insights as to where you should enter and how much of that market you should try. What is the niche within that market that you should really address and invest on capturing? Do not demonstrate your own profitability. That is to obfuscate your own profitability. Why? Well, you don't want to make that niche to become compelling for others. And the reason I have the Victoria's Secret card up there is because there's rather an infamous case where Victoria's Secret effectively invested in a presence of a seemingly competitive player, where in fact it was a company that was owned, that was affiliated with Victoria's Secret. And the key reason that they created a perception of two companies is to make that niche unappealing to potential entrants to the market. That is, while Victoria's Secret will be the high end of this, would cover the high end of this market, and this other entity would really be addressing a lower end of the market. And between two of us, it would make entering for a competitor to enter this market much less appealing. Because let's say if you go to a mall where both stores are present, probably the presence of the third store won't be such a lucrative opportunity. So ability to do that was a way for them to limit the interest of potential competitors. So that can be achieved obviously differently. And so you could achieve the same result by protecting weak competitors that are not necessarily a threat to your company's success, but would necessarily act as a deterrent to other potential competitors that want to enter the same niche. So we discussed the following concepts, and it's very important that in using these words, we understand, we share the same vocabulary, so we understand the concept and share the same definition for them. So we discussed resources. Sometimes they refer to them as capabilities. We necessarily highlighted the requirement for this to be unique. We define them as to be strategic assets. It's very important not only for the strategic assets to be present and sustainable. It's important to ask the question: what are the assets that are complementary? That is, the assets that help and reinforce each other. And one example I gave was the human capital and the relationship resource that combined together, that would be a pathway in developing a culture as a strategic resource. And of course, organizational competences, something that, in fact, capacity that allows you to combine these strategic resources to develop the successful product and service. And so to summarize the first and second components of the framework, we want to understand how we're going to create value and whether or not our customers will recognize it. Then when we create that value and we understand how customers will go about recognizing, discovering, and making their purchasing decision, we want to understand how we can protect that value, how we can capture it under the constant strength of our competitors, let alone to be in a startup scenario, to be able to enter market successfully and not only stay in the market, but then grow and thrive in the market. So this will be also a good time for questions for these two components before we continue on to the last third component on delivering value. Hi guys, do we have questions?
Let me check. Question. No. There is only my question and advice for them to be active. So, I see. Nelly Malayan has a question. So Nelly, please. Nelly, you can raise your question. Art, Nelly is asking about elaborating switching costs. She's saying, can you please elaborate about switching costs? Couldn't get the meaning.
Excellent question, Nelly. I'm glad you asked, and again, I encourage everyone to ask this question, because indeed the concepts that we're discussing, each single slide of this presentation can be a session itself. So I'm glad you really focused on this one. So let me give you an example. I know if you shopped on Amazon, for example, right? So what Amazon and many online websites now would allow you to do is to save your financial information, your credit card information. I mean, it's a very, again, seemingly simple method designed obviously to make your life easier. You don't want to re-enter your credit card information every time, and so you would have it stored with a certain website where you shop frequently. And I imagine That's something, you know, there are many services out there. Amazon was just an example. I mean, this is also a personal opinion, but interestingly enough, that often is a barrier enough for people to consider to purchase through Amazon, even if the same product is offered elsewhere for a price that is not necessarily, I mean, could be even lower. That is, the fact that I would have to go, for example, and enter my credit card information again with a different competitor I would have to run that analysis. And I say, well, is it worth? Is it really much comfortable for me just to go to Amazon and do it? I trust them. They have my credit card information. I don't want to give my credit confirmation to a new provider. So this is a very simple example of a switching cost. It could be something more profound. For example, we would consider if you're providing, for example, a service that requires a certain learning curve. For example, a solution that, again, I'll bring an example of a real drone for crop monitoring. For example, it takes a certain amount of time to learn to operate this drone. So every time that, you know, a customer would consider switching to a competitor that provides perhaps a better drone and maybe a more affordable drone, but it would require retraining. So that would be considered the switching cost. That is, I would have to incur certain costs to switch to a competitor. It could be, for example, location-based. If I could say, well, I'm based in a certain area that is easily accessible, for my customer to switch to a different customer, they have to travel farther. That could be a factor that could impact the cost of switching. And the question, again, always to add here would be, is this switching cost something that I can sustain? Is a sustainable advantage? So it's only then it can become a strategic resource. I hope that clarified. If you want to ask a follow-up question or anyone else, we perhaps have time for one or two more questions.
Any further questions, guys? Nelly is saying thank you. Got it.
You're welcome. So moving on. So we discovered what the customers want. We invested in R&D and developed something they actually recognize. It's, believe it or not, if you ask this question, then you are in much better shape than many other startups or even mature companies. And then if you spend time and considered your competitive landscape, and you really deeply thought of your strategic resources and how you can continue to build and sustain them, then again, you are in a much better place than many startups who did not really consider what is it about them that makes them unique. And for many startups, it's of course the founders, it's of course the know-how and the technological acumen. That's how most of the engineering teams start. Some companies do start with certain endowment of resources that could provide a tactical advantage. What is very important to appreciate is that we're really thinking about the long-term strategic resources that you'll be able to build over time, and you have a good reason to think that you'll be good at in building those resources. That is, the markets and the products that you do in the markets you enter would necessarily be tilted in your favor. And so think the resources that you have, the ones that you would need to develop the product and enter the market, and the ones you would actually be able to sustain. So once you do all of that, the question then becomes, well, I was able to create the product. I was able to understand the competitive landscapes and perhaps even, I think about how I would strategically capture that niche. The third component is how this value in that competitive landscape, or in spite of competitive landscape, would be delivered to the customer. And so that we term the vertical competition. And to contrast it with the capturing value component we just discussed, that is the horizontal competition, when we think about the market power, that is my presence in my market, my ability to develop a better product, more affordable product. How do I compete with my existing competitors, and how I prevent other competitors entering the market. So that's the horizontal competition. When we think about the vertical competition, we're really talking about bargaining power. And I do like the word vertical collaboration much more, but certainly to just contrast it with the horizontal competition, we'll call it a competition for now. So the difference between the market power discussion we had for the horizontal competition, the vertical competition is really your ability as a company to come to an arrangement with your partners, right? So your bargaining power. And two good cases are, in terms of the culture of this approach, are Walmart and Toyota. Because the fundamental tension that we discussed in a couple of slides is really the following. You have an option of collaborating and working together and creating the value for the end customer and sharing that value, or it can be more of a competitive disposition. That is how I capture the value that is created, right? So just give you an example, right? And we'll imagine sort of an abstract supply chain, value chain channel. And for definition's sake, we'll define it as everything you need in order to design, develop, and deliver your product to customers. So for example, if you're in a business of agricultural technology and you need certain components for your solution, be it hardware, software, your upstream suppliers will be providers of those components. Could be sensors, could be drones, could be software. So everything you need for your company to add the value, to develop the value that your product delivers. You can think of it as literally everything, not just option suppliers vis-a-vis your components, but also your team. If you're working with a recruitment agency, that recruitment agency would be an example of a partner that helps you find and build your human capital. And so the downstream partners would be the partners that help you deliver your product. For example, in case of hardware, for example, technology, it could be a distributor that sells your product to end user. It could be a retail store. If you are growing apples, it could be the grocery store. Yeah. So think of this value chain, supply chain, as the entities that you would have to depend on to a varying degree, but everything that will go into creating and delivering your product. Right? And so when you think about that, then certainly these two questions come up, right? So how is the final product priced? And how do I price my role in this value chain? And then how do I negotiate this arrangement with both my upstream partners, that is the price and the relationship and all the contractual arrangements I have with my providers, my suppliers for my components. If I'm growing apples, then it will be my fertilizer and everything else I need, the water supply. If I'm manufacturing drone, there will be hardware and software components, etc. And of course, what would be my partners downstream? It would be a grocery store, it would be a reseller, it would be a distributor, right? And with all of them, I will have to find out, how much they're going to charge me, how much I'm going to charge them, what would be many other terms of those relationships, and what would be an ongoing relationship with these partners. Again, implicitly in all of this will bring up the issue of time, which is really would be the last question I will ask at the end of the session. But make sure you have it, make sure you stress it, because everything that we're discussing is not static. So all these criteria have to be examined over time. And so this tension is really dynamic in nature. Relationships do change. The landscape competitive as well as the vertical competition landscape changes. Your supplier might go out of business. Your distributor can go out of business, or vice versa. And so this is examples, for example, of an Apple and Verizon. Verizon being the distributor of Apple iPhone products. And I bring this example because there was a time when the Verizon was an exclusive distributor, and the question then becomes: is this the type of relationship you want to have with your downstream supplier? Dell and Microsoft as an example of a relationship where Microsoft would be an upstream supplier of an operating system for integrated Dell that will build on computers and ship the Microsoft operating system with their product. So the question to ask and to really examine your bargaining power within your projected or existing value chain is to understand the following: who is the customer of my customer, and who is the supplier of my supplier? That is, will the customers go look for my product to the distributor, or they would go to the distributor to buy because that distributor they're more comfortable to working with? And in other words, if you were to choose of two telecommunication service providers, would you make the choice between going to one or another based on the fact that they have a good phone service, or whether one of them offers an iPhone product? Right? So this is really the question of who owns the customer. Yeah? How much bargaining power I have with the distributors, because I know when the customers go to the store, they're asking for my product and for my service, right? Or I'm really one of the, I don't really have that bargaining power, and it's really the end distributor that sets the terms for how much, whether they would sell my product to begin with, and how much I'll be able to ask for it. Similarly, if I have a supplier upstream that provides a very important component or service that goes into my product, would customers choose my product because of them or because of the value that I'm creating? Right? So this is a fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself vis-a-vis your product or service to understand the dynamics of the bargaining process or collaborative process between the players in the supply chain. And of course, the best rule and the best relationships happen when we say that there is collaborative spirit, that we're able to build a relationship where we all could grow the value, not to fight over a fixed, a cake or a fixed pie, but try to increase the size of the pie so everybody benefits. That's really the underlying philosophy, and that depending on your circumstances, understanding the vertical competition is key to your ability delivering to your customer and then extracting a value that is not only good for you, but also good for your partners, because if you extract too much of it, then your partners will be disincentivized to work with you. And so long term, this goes into the type of relationships, strategic relationships, strategic resources that you can build over time, that even if there is a better price on the market for a supplier or and also for a distributor, they would still consider working with you because of the years of established rapport, collaborative spirit between you. So how do you capture more value? Of course, by increasing your differentiation. Yeah, you develop better product, you made it more recognizable by your customers. It is also an issue of bargaining power, whether your product will be white labeled or it will be visible to end customers. In other words, if I am selling an apple for a grocery store, would my brand of my farm be visible to the customers? They will demand to buy apples only from specific grower. Similarly, if I'm selling a drone or a component for a drone, would that component be white label, or it would have my logo and brand and will be very recognizable, and in fact customers will go for it. Hence my ability to attract and customers, and hence increase my bargaining power would increase, right? If I cannot increase differentiation, or it can obviously can do it at the same time, you can try to undermine differentiation elsewhere by requiring, for example, open standards. And of course, you're a small player, associations that push for open standards, that undermine ability of a bigger, more resourceful players to set the agenda to really highlight their differentiation. Yeah. Again, encouraging other weaker competitors to enter the market is an ability, is a way to ensure that differentiation is reduced. And of course, just simply entering the market as a new presence, as a statement that can reduce and undermine differentiation elsewhere. So we discussed this, and again, I cannot overstress this enough. A fundamental tension in a value chain is a question: do I want to collaborate with my partners, while I'm really competing with them and trying to capture and extract as much value as I can? I would really encourage to think about this strategically, and really building a strategic approach to building these relationships, because depending on the context of your product and service, this could indeed be the source of a great, if not sole, competitive advantage for your product and service. And in order to, of course, achieve this, I mean, you have to be very honest. I mean, this is not collaboration for its sake. You have to be very honest with this question. What is it that you need from your partner to create your value? So in deep thinking and deep consideration of this question would necessarily reveal how much you are dependent on this partner, and hence how much of that conversation would go to benefit you, and how much you're prepared to give up to work with them, because this again can have a long-term effects. You might initially agree to an arrangement that might have a tactical advantage, and longer term ensure that you gain a better position in the market. So to achieve that, I think it's very important to have mechanisms to reassure your vertical partners. That is, the contracts and arrangements you reach with your suppliers or distributors, think of them as never complete. Make sure that you have enough of both informal as well as formal legal mechanisms to revise agreements and make this an ongoing relationship. Yeah. Consider strategically from the very beginning with a co-ownership that is vested interest in the aspect of your product or the product itself, or the company. It could be a joint venture, for example, with a longer term purchase option as a possibility, especially since you're just entering the market. And sometimes the suppliers that are already in the market or the distributors are already in the market could be effectively most viable exit strategy for your startup. And of course, as a demonstration of parity and equity is from the get-go, you could consider to commit to parity. That is, to information exchange, to licensing considerations, to open standards that would ensure that irrespective of what the future holds, there will be a degree of fairness and access to information for both sides, which would strengthen the longer-term collaboration. And so that concludes the framework. as much as I could fit in 1 hour we had. And the next slide is really the question I was building up this presentation to ask, is the one that I think more explicitly refers to time as a major factor in strategic decision making. That is, once you're able to discuss the value creation, the capturing value vis-a-vis your competitors, as well as the ability to deliver by collaborating with your value chain partners, the question then becomes, well, how long this will last? Whatever I'm thinking now, how quickly this will all change? How long my product will be relevant and innovative in this market? Right? And so what implicitly we've been stating throughout this session was that the goal of strategy is not to achieve a static balance. The goal of your strategy is to achieve a dynamic balance. That is, have a strategic plan that not only takes into account the complexity of the static variables, what your customers want now, what your competitors do now, what your partners do now, but necessarily what your customers, what your product, what your competitor, what your partner will do tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, right? And so the complexity of time being added to already complex landscape makes this question real the what's known as the holy grail of strategic problem. And this is what actually my thesis at MIT focused in, thinking about how we can reduce the complexity of a strategic decision making when time is concerned. Okay? And so for the purposes of this session, because we don't have time, we'll stop here and we'll simply ask the last question as a really gateway for you to question that, because this will be ultimately the question you would need to ask yourselves. How do we enable all this thinking over time? That is how we go through this framework for creating, capturing, delivering value, not just today, but over time. Because achieving that success over time would mean that we succeeded. The discussions that are centered around static variables, that is, what are the choices of my startup at a given point in time, give us a snapshot of what we need to consider. What is clear now, I hope, for everyone is that we needed to do it over time for it actually to be a successful process. And of course, the question, the answer to the question how fast you should innovate or how fast you should be able to reconsider all these variables and go back to the drawing board and sort of think about the rate of innovation within your company, is of course to answer the question how long you can expect your core markets to continue to be profitable. That is, again, to return to your customer definition, to return to the question whether or not the new innovative value is recognized by the customers, whether or not the competitive landscape changed, and whether or not your vertical competition or partners have repositioned. And so this is the summary of what has been presented today. I would leave this on